Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to take a break from looking at translated literature because one of the most unknown and underrated living American writers just released a book without any fanfare a couple of weeks ago. I'm of course talking about Evan Dara's new book, Permanent Earthquake. I'll get into specifics in a minute, but man, this is one of those books that really just reminds me why I love to read. I read this book in like a day and a half, and I can't wait to reread it. I haven't actually read all of Evan Dara's other works. I've read The Lost Scrapbook, and I've had Flea on my shelf for way too long. I think after I read The Lost Scrapbook, I absolutely loved it. I didn't want to go through and read all of his books because I wanted to, kind of savor them, but that might be the reasoning of a sophist. But anyways, Permanent Earthquake is nothing like The Lost Scrapbook. It's completely different, whereas The Lost Scrapbook is really a sort of kaleidoscopic look at 1990s in America. Permanent Earthquake is much more of a straightforward narrative based in a sort of post-apocalyptic climate dystopia that has a much more straightforward plot. I'll try my best to not spoil too much of the book because it was just released a couple of weeks ago, and instead I'll focus more on the larger setting and some of the more abstract themes of this book because I really think that people should read this book and experience it. It was quite the experience to read over this past weekend. This book is really just about a guy trying to survive during an ecological apocalypse. He's on an island, probably somewhere in the Caribbean, just based on the town names being French and it being described like a jungle island. And on this island, they're experiencing an earthquake that is, well, permanent. It's non-stop. It fluctuates in intensities between what our narrator labels Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4. And it's unclear how long this earthquake has been going on, but it's certainly been going on long enough for for most of the members of the island to adapt to it in some way. These people wear mouth guards all the time because if they didn't, they would break their teeth or bite their tongues or cheeks. They're kitted out in elbow pads, knee pads, wrist pads. Some even go around wearing helmets. See, when this earth shake, which is what it's called often, is at a level Q1, it's difficult for people to even walk around, and they're constantly tripping and falling over. At Q2 and Q3, well, it's hard to maintain steady contact with the ground for too long. This means that people can barely sleep. The earthquake is also incredibly noisy as well. And it takes ages for them to move around and get stuff done, as they can only manage a few steps every minute as they wobble and try to walk as carefully as possible as to not injure themselves. They can't control their bodies, as the environment around them disallows any sort of control. Let me just read you a description so you can get a taste for Dara's writing. I take first steps into the clearing. It's the broad field leading to the dispensary, and its fence forms part of the low, stormboat horizon. The field is filled with people. It must be closer to the dispensary's closing time than I had thought. I see them all. Bodies, dozens of them, flailing and caving in convulsion rhythms, their limber forms flaming, as if harrowed by fears erupting from cellular levels. One body turns and turns in place, immobilized by movement. One dives to the earth as his shirt lifts off and floats inflated before covering him like a shroud. A ragged silhouette arms semaphores no one can understand. The vast skillet of the world heating and turning human presence into puffs of smoke. The flung dry dirt when they hit the ground. The Q3 sounds are perfect accompaniment to this pitiless choreography. Distant bodies fall to the earth and, to the land's roaring, seem to bring up necks and chests in coordinated ways. Scattered rag wearers drop to their knees and become a congregation in prayer. People waving panicked arms turn into a chorus petitioning the sky. Widely separate on the springing field, two scarecrow women stand with their mouths gaping, a duet singing a silent lamentation. Then come the solos. One woman gymnasts backwards through the air. A bent man with a bent walking stick does an involuntary jiggerbug. An indistinguishable being stands with arms and legs X outstretched, then vanishes from the stage. Bubble people above the boiling land. I love his writing style. I love how he uses nouns as verbs, and just his descriptions are just incredible. This sort of ecological apocalypse is so interesting, as it's clear that Dara is playing with contemporary fears and anxieties surrounding things like climate change. It actually reminded me a lot of N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season, which is published as a fantasy book, but it's as literary as it gets. And speaking of this sort of subgenre of the literary apocalypse, for me, this book is up there with Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which I haven't gotten around to getting a decent edition of, and Colson Whitehead's Zone 1, both of which do really interesting things with their respective apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic worlds. What Dara does so well is not only does he have this really compelling and really intrusive apocalyptic gimmick of the permanent earthquake, but he uses it so effectively to explore societal issues like exploitation of labor, alienation, colonialism. There are these super subtle hints that he drops that I think allow us to read into this colonial aspect of this world. And he explores philosophies like existentialism and postmodernism, which isn't really a philosophy, but this book is super postmodern in some really interesting ways. I'll read a passage that I really like concerning this later in the video. So our mostly unnamed protagonist, this book, by the way, begins in the first person, but by page I think 25, it changes into the third person. It's sort of unclear why this happens, but I suspect there's something going on with some sort of trauma-induced depersonalization as a result of his experiences in this earthquake. But anyways, our narrator is on this island trying to survive, and he eventually decides to try to search for a so-called still spot. He's heard stories about such a place, but he's not sure if it exists or not, or if it exists on his tiny little island that he's on. So he goes on a quest to try to find it. And that's essentially the plot. Obviously a lot more interesting things happen throughout, but that's all I kind of want to talk about plot-wise. While he's searching for this still spot, though, he needs to go to these dispensaries that are set up in different towns where he can buy equipment, right? If he loses a knee pad or he needs food, he obviously needs to go and get more supplies. But of course, even during the apocalypse, capitalism persists, and he needs to work to be able to afford these supplies. What he does for work is really interesting. He just kind of goes around and gathers stones, like big 30 to 50 pound stones that are just laying in fields, and he carries them to these large houses called manses, which are being built all around the island. A manse is traditionally at least a house that a member of the clergy would live in. So there's kind of this religious overtone to this entire endeavor. But for each stone he turns in to help build these houses, he gets basically a few bucks. When I at least see a person carrying stones in a novel, I immediately can't not compare it to the Greek mythological figure Sisyphus, who has to, kind of famously push a boulder up a mountain every single day for all of eternity, and every day he has to start anew. And of course, perhaps almost just as famously as the original myth is Albert Camus' book-length essay on this topic, The Myth of Sisyphus, which Camus uses to explore his philosophical ideas of things like absurdism and existentialism. Dara is clearly doing this as well, and he's clearly drawing from Camus a bit here. But more specifically, I think he's more focused on exposing this capitalistic market that is creating this brutal exploitation of labor. Remember, the ground never stops shaking. The main character is constantly tripping and crashing down to the ground, getting seriously injured while carrying these heavy stones. And he's a young, healthy guy. We see older people or injured people attempting to do the same thing and getting way more hurt and way more exhausted. The purposelessness of this task is really felt by our main character, to the point where at one point he even laments, if his purpose is to generate purpose, then that is no purpose at all. And this purposelessness is so pervasive, and he keeps trying to connect himself to something larger, but constantly fails to do so. At another point, he tries to connect himself to something larger than himself, And the text reads, "He looks to the sky, starts to think of himself as something else, as a pod, a seed leaning to growth, maybe as an ornament, a dressing for a land wound. He stops these thoughts in their tracks. Inflation, preachings, sad self-aggrandizements. There is nothing here of the symbolic or the archetypal, nothing mythic, mythopoetic. He is a squirrel lying and writhing in a ditch, alone, shaking, crumbling, falling more times than he can count or compensate for, trying to put an end to it, and that is it." What's so interesting about this entire market is that a market obviously needs a demand, and this is where we get these manse owners who are building these massive houses out of stones, and these houses are pretty ornate. They're built all with stone, but they have big glass windows and stuff like that. I'm not really sure how it works architecturally or physically as an earthquake happening, but it works. Regrettably, we don't get too much of these manse owners, but we quickly see that they're quite rich and happy to exploit these struggling people. We even see individuals disassembling their own houses and huts to sell their stones to these manse owners so they can buy new knee pads and wrist guards and stuff like that. That is, again, even during the apocalypse, there is a clear divide between the haves and the have-nots. And of course, this relationship, I think, should bring up images of slavery and colonialism, especially as this is happening on an island in the Caribbean. There are a few rich people on the island who are building these giant mansions and living probably quite happily, while the rest of the inhabitants are going through this brutal labor to build those very houses. I think Dara is really commenting on current economic trends and the increasing divide between the lower classes and the upper class. Never mind commenting on the entire history of the exploitation of labor in the West, especially, that he's clearly interested in. As I noted earlier, we see these subtle hints that we should be reading this book as not just a book about a dystopian ecological crisis, but about our past and our present as well. We see factories and mines polluting rivers. We see the exploitation of labor, like we just talked about. We see an ecological world in crisis. At one point, the narrator even suggests that the Earth is ravaging itself. He's not super overt about this. He's a really good author who uses the subtlety of language and imagery and metaphor to allow us to read our own various meanings into his world. For example, at one point he's walking through a field, or trying to walk through a field, and all of a sudden a bunch of bones start rising up from the dirt as they're shaken from the surface. And the text reads, "Don't," he says to the jostling bones. "Why are they here? Why are they rising now?" He does not know if the bones are from people or from animals. If from people, are they the bones of those who have crossed this field before him? Victims of a massacre? Something dire from colonial times? There are no gravestones, no crosses, no stars, not a trace of a fence or of a walkway stones, or of walkway stones. Were those ransacked for the manses? He spins around, his head goes light, he falls. When he lands, his left shoulder hits one rounded knob, his rib another, the brusque pain of bone on bone. It's a pretty haunting image. There's also this constant refrain of noise, as this world shake is described as not just a physical experience, but an auditory experience as well. There's so much noise. Again, with all this noise, characters find it difficult to sleep or to communicate. Our main character speaks in a sort of, I hate this phrase, but I think it actually works here, a sort of broken English, which is reproduced on the page, quite interestingly, in all capital letters. And these characters find it difficult to think. This noise is so reminiscent of the modern world that is filled with noise, right? The noise of traffic and televisions, of course, but also the noise, I think, of stress and anxiety and, well, the noise created by things like social media in our minds. Again, Dara is my favorite kind of writer in that he invites all of these metaphoric readings onto his text without being didactic or preachy about them. I won't bore you with all of the kind of metaphoric readings that I read into this book, but I do want to quickly read this passage in which our main character stumbles upon a pair of headphones in the dirt. 20 minutes more, and he sees in the grass a long wiggly line of white with a small white head, like an extravagant tapeworm pulled from some unspecified host organism. He stops, bends, regains his footing, picks the thing up. It's a cord leading to an earbud, one limb torn away. He holds it in his covered hands, lets it droop. It is not clean, but it comforts him. This plastic tapeworm, a parasite, both feeding and fed, lets him know. He is heading towards the airport. This contrast between the interior noise and the exterior noise is explored quite a bit. But as I think things like personal trauma and anxiety mirror this constant earth shake that inhibits our protagonist. Inside all of us is this constant unsteadiness, and our earth is just simply mimicking us in a way. There's a lot more to be said about this idea, I think, but I'll leave it there for now. Again, I don't want to spoil too much here, and I hope these little snippets aren't actually spoiling anything, but instead just giving you a little taste of his writing. But I do want to briefly talk about these flashback scenes that sort of bleed into our main storyline. As the book goes on, these flashback scenes get longer and longer. And again, I won't spoil much, but these flashback scenes explore our main character's childhood with his parents. His father is an often unemployed teacher who has difficulty landing a long-term job, and the family has to move around quite a bit. His father specializes in 19th century history with a focus on, quote, the liberal revolutions, 1830, 1848, 1870, reason over illusion, shared over clutched, the Enlightenment, looking at itself in the mirror and seeing a politics. And then a bit later in the book, so do feel free to skip ahead until this text is off the screen. Though again, this doesn't really spoil anything. His father just has this sort of amazing soliloquy on philosophy that I just need to include on this video. Amazing, this tendency towards obscured positives, his father said. Think about it. The need to see patterns behind. Unwarranted optimism. I mean, it's everywhere. It's in Plato, in Zoroaster. It's all over Christ and Marx, all the dreamer millennialists, Hayek and Desjardins. Induction, structuralism and deconstruction. The Heart Sutra, expectation, Michel's and Bakunin. Perfect orderliness, just waiting to be found. Laws, forms, straight lines. Why this doubleness, this dualism, a cosmology built on false foundations, seen and unseen, and somehow the unseen always regular, predictable, productive, better. What a comfort. Behind the chaos lies comprehensibility, purity, meaning. Where does this come from? Dear Friar Occam, is meaning ever simple? Of course the need creates the finding, but fear and nothing are bad parents. In mechanics, quantum mechanics, the substrate is per randomness, a breakdown and dissolutions. So, okay, watch out for this system of system, the blind gendarmerie of thought. Common perception is a mollifying imposition, a palliative. Behind the chaos is more chaos. It's such a great quote that explores postmodernist ideologies. I say this in almost every video, but there is so much to say about this book. It was unexpectedly published, and it's been one of my favorites that I've read this year so far, and I have so many notes and so many quotes written down. Maybe at some point I'll do a more focused video on a specific part of this book. But I hope that this video gave you a taste for this book. I cannot recommend it enough. I usually don't really like apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic books, as I often find the genre to be tedious and repetitive, but Permanent Earthquake stands proudly alongside a few in this genre that I cannot wait to come back to. Let me know what you think about Permanent Earthquake and about all of Evan Dara's work. I really look forward to him becoming more well-known, and I'm genuinely excited to see what others think of this book. But for now, thanks for watching.